I was sitting in my car outside the Pine Grove Orphanage on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, watching my husband of 32 years walk through those heavy wooden doors carrying a bag of groceries and wearing a smile I hadn't seen on his face in over a decade, and something inside my chest cracked open like ice breaking on a frozen lake. He had told me that morning, just like he told me every Wednesday morning for the past 3 years, that he had a standing meeting with potential investors for his consulting firm, meetings that always ran late, meetings that always left him exhausted and distant when he finally came home around 8 in the evening smelling like coffee, and something I could never quite place. But I had followed him today, followed him for the first time in our entire marriage, because 2 weeks earlier, I had found a receipt in his jacket pocket, a receipt from a toy store for $372 worth of educational games and building blocks, and when I asked him about it casually over dinner, he looked me straight in the eye and told me he had no idea what I was talking about, that it must have been someone else's receipt, that maybe it got mixed up at the dry cleaners. That lie, so smooth and so confident, made my skin crawl, because in 32 years of marriage, Richard had never been a good liar. He always got flustered and over-explained, but this lie came out of his mouth like he had practiced it, like he had been preparing for this exact question. So I followed him, and now I was watching him disappear into an orphanage I didn't even know existed in our town, and I sat there with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to find an innocent explanation, trying to be the understanding wife I had been trained to be for over 3 decades. But what they didn't know, what my husband and whoever else was involved in this couldn't possibly have anticipated in their careful planning and meticulous lies, is that I wasn't going to stay in that car wondering and worrying and making excuses for him like I had done for years with smaller betrayals and dismissals. I got out of that car and I walked into that orphanage, and what I discovered in the next 45 minutes didn't just destroy my marriage, it revealed a conspiracy so elaborate and so cruel that it had been stealing pieces of my soul for 13 years. And what I did when I finally understood the full scope of their betrayal, when I finally connected every lie and every manipulation and every moment of grief they had put me through, what I did next didn't just give me justice, it gave me back a life I thought was gone forever, and it made every single person who participated in this nightmare pay in ways they never saw coming. Before I tell you exactly what I found inside that orphanage, before I walk you through every devastating detail of the lies I uncovered and the revenge I executed with surgical precision, if you are someone who has ever felt that sickening sensation of knowing something is wrong but being told you're paranoid, if you have ever trusted someone completely only to find out that trust was being used as a weapon against you, then subscribe to this channel right now and turn on all notifications. Because what I'm about to share with you is a story about a woman who was told her child was dead for 13 years, who grieved and suffered and nearly lost herself completely, only to discover that death was a lie created by the people who claimed to love her most. This channel is dedicated to stories of women who refused to accept the reality that was handed to them, who dug for truth even when everyone told them to let it go, who fought back against betrayals so deep they redefined the meaning of cruelty. If you want to see what happens when a mother discovers her child is alive, and the people who hid him from her face consequences that will haunt them forever, subscribe right now, because what comes next in my story will show you that maternal instinct is the most powerful force on earth, and when you weaponize a mother's love through lies and theft, you create an enemy who will never, ever stop until justice is served. Let me take you back to the beginning, back to who I was before that September afternoon, before everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be constructed from lies as delicate and deliberate as a spider's web. I was 51 years old, and I had spent the majority of my adult life being exactly what everyone told me a good wife and mother should be. I met Richard when I was 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in early childhood education, and dreams of opening my own preschool someday. Dreams that felt so vivid and possible back then that I could taste them. He was 28, already establishing himself in the business consulting world, confident and charming and so sure of himself that being near him felt like standing in the sun after a long winter. We got married 8 months after we met, and I remember my mother pulling me aside the night before the wedding and saying with this strange sadness in her voice, You're going to be so busy taking care of him and his dreams that you'll forget you have your own, and I laughed it off because I was young and in love and convinced that supporting your partner was the same thing as building a life together. I was wrong, but it would take me decades to understand just how wrong. The first few years were good, or at least I remember them as good, though looking back now with eyes that finally see clearly, I wonder how much of that goodness was just me convincing myself that sacrificing my ambitions was noble instead of tragic. Richard's career took off quickly, and my role became supporting that success in every possible way. I attended every corporate dinner, smiled at every client, made our home into a showpiece that reflected well on his professional image, and slowly, so slowly I barely noticed it happening, my dream of owning a preschool got packed away like winter clothes you think you'll need again, but never quite get around to unpacking. We tried to have children for 5 years before it finally happened. 5 years of doctors and treatments and disappointments that left me feeling broken and desperate. And when I finally got pregnant at 32 years old, I thought it was the universe telling me that all that waiting and suffering had been for a purpose. I thought wrong about that too. My son was born on a Tuesday morning in May, and they placed him in my arms, and I looked into his eyes, these impossibly dark eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies, and I felt something lock into place inside my chest that I hadn't even known was missing. We named him James, after Richard's father who had passed away the year before, and for the first 6 months of his life I lived in this exhausted, beautiful bubble where nothing else mattered except this tiny person who depended on me completely. Richard was traveling more for work, sometimes gone for a week or two at a time, but I told myself it was necessary, that he was building security for our family, that his absence was a form of love even if it felt like abandonment. I was alone most of the time with James, just the two of us in that big house, and I poured everything I had into him, all the dreams I had deferred, and all the love I had been storing up for years, and he thrived. He was a happy baby, always smiling, always curious, and when he was around 6 months old, he started doing this thing where he would grab my face with both his little hands and just stare at me like he was memorizing every feature, and I would stare back and think, this is it. This is what I was made for. This is the meaning of everything. And then one morning in November, 2 weeks after James turned 7 months old, I woke up and went to his crib and he wasn't breathing. The next hours were a blur of ambulances and emergency rooms and doctors with terrible sympathetic faces telling me words that didn't make sense. Words like sudden infant death syndrome and nothing you could have done, and sometimes these things just happen. Richard flew home immediately, and I remember him walking into that hospital room and the look on his face, this mix of devastation and something else I couldn't identify at the time, something that looking back now I recognize as guilt. And he held me while I sobbed so hard I thought my body would break apart. And he kept saying, we'll get through this. We'll survive this. We have to be strong. We buried our baby boy on a gray Friday afternoon with rain falling like the sky was crying with us. And I stood at that tiny grave and felt something inside me die along with him, some essential part of myself that I knew I would never get back. The grief that followed James's death was like living underwater, everything muffled and distant and requiring enormous effort just to move through. I stopped sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours a night, stopped eating anything that required preparation, stopped answering phone calls from friends who wanted to help but didn't know how. Richard threw himself into work even more intensely than before, and I understood it, or thought I did. I understood that everyone grieves differently, and if staying busy helped him cope, then I shouldn't begrudge him that, even though it meant I was alone in that house filled with baby things I couldn't bring myself to pack away. Months turned into years, and slowly, painfully, I learned how to function again, how to smile at the grocery store and make small talk at the few social obligations I couldn't avoid, and pretend that I was healing when really I was just getting better at hiding the wound that never stopped bleeding. Richard and I grew further apart, not dramatically, not with fights or accusations, just this slow drift into being roommates who shared a house and a last name, but not much else. We stopped talking about James after the first year because every time his name came up, Richard would get this look on his face like he was in physical pain and he would leave the room. And eventually, I learned to carry my grief silently, to cry in the shower where he couldn't hear me, to visit that tiny grave by myself on birthdays and holidays and random Tuesdays when the missing became too heavy to carry alone. I suggested marriage counseling once, about 5 years after James died, and Richard looked at me with something close to panic in his eyes and said we didn't need strangers poking around in our pain, that we were doing fine, that time heals all wounds if you just give it space. I believed him because it was easier than fighting, easier than admitting that our marriage had become a performance we both participated in without ever acknowledging the script. I started volunteering at a local community center, teaching art classes to elementary school kids, and it helped, having these small people around me who needed attention and patience and encouragement. It filled some of the emptiness, even though every dark-haired boy with curious eyes made my chest ache with what I had lost. Richard's career continued to flourish. He made partner at his firm. We bought a bigger house in a better neighborhood, and from the outside we probably looked like success, like a couple who had survived tragedy and come out stronger. But inside I was hollow, going through motions, waiting for something I couldn't name. Then came that Wednesday 3 weeks ago when I found the toy store receipt, and something that had been sleeping inside me for 13 years woke up with a gasp. I found it on a Sunday afternoon while Richard was playing golf, found it tucked into the inside pocket of his gray suit jacket, the one he wore to important meetings. $372 at a toy store called Wonder Years, purchased on a Tuesday at 2:15 in the afternoon, and the items listed were specific, educational building blocks for ages 7 to 9, a science kit for elementary students, art supplies, books about space, and dinosaurs, and ancient Egypt. These weren't random toys. These weren't gifts for a coworker's child or donations to a charity drive. These were carefully selected items for a specific child who loved learning. And when I saw that list, something clicked in my brain like a key turning in a lock. James would have been 13 years old. James, if he had lived, would have been exactly the age to have moved beyond these toys, but a younger sibling or a child Richard was somehow involved with might be 7 or 8 or 9. I sat on our bedroom floor holding that receipt and feeling my heart beat so hard it hurt, and I made myself breathe slowly and think clearly and not jump to conclusions, because jumping to conclusions was how you ended up looking crazy and paranoid, and exactly like the grief-stricken mother everyone expected you to be. So I put the receipt back exactly where I found it, and I started paying attention in ways I hadn't bothered to pay attention in years, because when you're just trying to survive each day, you stop noticing patterns. But when you start looking for patterns, they're everywhere, glaring and obvious and impossible to miss once you see them. Richard left every Wednesday morning at 9 and came home every Wednesday evening around 8. He took his phone into the bathroom with him every single time. He started password protecting his laptop when he used to leave it open on the kitchen counter. He did laundry himself now, something he never did before, always insisting his clothes go to the dry cleaner, but now he washed his own casual clothes, and I found it odd but not alarming until I started connecting it to everything else. And 2 Wednesdays ago, I suggested we do something together on a Wednesday evening, suggested it casually like it had just occurred to me, and the way his face changed, the flash of panic before he smoothed it into regret and told me his Wednesday meetings were unmovable, that they were with the firm's most important potential clients. That flash of panic told me everything I needed to know. So I followed him, and that's how I ended up sitting in my car outside Pine Grove Orphanage watching my husband of 32 years walk through the doors like he belonged there. I sat in that car for maybe 5 minutes after he went inside, 5 minutes of my brain trying to create innocent explanations. Maybe he volunteers there. Maybe he mentors troubled kids as some kind of therapy for losing James. Maybe this is all perfectly reasonable and I'm being paranoid like he's been subtly suggesting I am for years every time I question anything. But the receipt wasn't for one child. It was for one specific child. And the amount of money and the frequency of these Wednesday visits and the elaborate lies all pointed to something much bigger than volunteer work. So I got out of the car and I walked across that parking lot and I opened the heavy wooden door and I stepped into a bright, cheerful entryway that smelled like crayons and fresh bread and childhood. And there was a woman at the front desk, maybe in her 60s, with kind eyes and a name tag that said Dorothy, and she looked up at me with a smile and said, "Can I help you?" And I opened my mouth to ask about Richard, to demand answers, but something stopped me, some instinct that told me if I came in aggressive and demanding I would get nowhere, that I needed to be smart about this, strategic. So I smiled back, and I said I was interested in learning about volunteer opportunities, that I had heard wonderful things about this facility from a friend, and could someone give me a tour and tell me about their programs? Dorothy's smile got even warmer, and she said, "Of course, let me see if our director is available." And she picked up the phone and had a brief conversation, and then told me Director Patricia would be happy to show me around. And while we waited, I looked at the walls covered in children's artwork and photographs of smiling kids, and felt this strange, surreal sensation, like I was in a dream, like this couldn't possibly be real. Patricia came out a few minutes later, a thin woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake, and she started walking me through the facility, talking about their programs and their philosophy, and how they served about 40 children ranging from infants to teenagers. And I nodded and smiled and asked appropriate questions while my eyes scanned every room we passed, looking for Richard, looking for anything that would explain why he was here. We walked past a common room where kids were doing homework, and a kitchen where teenagers were learning to cook, and an art room filled with supplies. And then we turned a corner, and I saw through a window into a small library, and there he was. Richard was sitting in a chair with a book open on his lap, and across from him in another chair was a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair and olive skin and a serious expression, and they were reading together, Richard's lips moving as he read out loud, and the boy leaning forward listening with complete attention. And I stopped walking so abruptly that Patricia almost bumped into me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, because that boy sitting across from my husband in a library in an orphanage I didn't know existed, that boy had James's eyes. Not similar eyes, not eyes that kind of reminded me in the way that every dark-eyed child reminded me a little bit of my son, but the exact same eyes, the same shape and color, and way of looking at the world with that intense, curious focus that had made James special even as a baby. I must have made some kind of sound because Patricia touched my arm and asked if I was all right, and I forced myself to smile and nod and say, "I'm fine, just got a little dizzy for a second, low blood sugar probably." And she offered to get me some water, and I said, "No thank you, I'm fine, who is that?" I pointed at the window. "Who is that man reading with that child?" Patricia followed my gaze, and her face softened into this fond expression, and she said, "Oh, that's one of our regular volunteers. He comes every Wednesday afternoon to spend time with Michael." And my heart stopped, actually stopped for a moment before starting again with painful, irregular beats. "Michael?" I said, keeping my voice steady, keeping my face arranged in polite curiosity. "That's wonderful that he has a consistent mentor. Has he been coming long?" 3 years, Patricia said. "Ever since Michael came to us when he was 5, and honestly, Richard has been a godsend. Michael doesn't bond easily with people, but he and Richard connected immediately. It's really quite special." 3 years, I thought. 3 years of Wednesday visits. 3 years of lies about investor meetings. 3 years of my husband building a relationship with a child who had my dead son's eyes. And I smiled at Patricia and said, "That's beautiful. It's so important for children to have that consistency." And inside, I was screaming. Inside, I was falling apart. But outside, I kept my voice pleasant and my expression interested, because I had learned over 13 years of grief how to hide what I was really feeling, how to perform normalcy even when everything inside was chaos. I need to pause here and ask you something from my heart to yours, woman to woman, mother to mother. Have you ever had that moment where your entire reality shifts, where everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down, and suddenly you're looking at your whole life through a completely different lens and seeing patterns and lies and manipulations you missed because you trusted someone completely? Have you ever felt that specific kind of betrayal, where it's not just that someone lied to you, but that they let you suffer, let you grieve, let you break apart and barely put yourself back together, all while knowing they could end your pain with the truth, but they chose not to? If right now you're feeling that burning rage mixed with absolute horror, because you know exactly what I'm talking about, because you've had your own moment of devastating clarity where you realized the people you trusted most were the ones hurting you most, I want you to do something powerful for yourself right now. Write in the comments, "I trust my instincts now." Just those 4 words. This isn't just a comment on a YouTube video. This is your declaration to yourself and to everyone who has ever made you doubt your own perceptions, who has ever called you paranoid or overly sensitive or dramatic when you knew something was wrong. When you write those words, you're telling yourself that you will never again ignore that voice inside that speaks truth even when everyone around you is speaking lies. And you're helping every other woman who comes to this channel at 2 in the morning unable to sleep because something feels wrong, but she can't prove it yet, who desperately needs permission to trust herself, to investigate, to demand answers instead of accepting explanations that don't add up. Write it now. I trust my instincts now. Thank you for that declaration. Now let me show you what happened when I finally started trusting my instincts completely. I finished the tour with Patricia, smiled and nodded and collected brochures about volunteer opportunities, and then I walked back to my car on legs that barely supported me. And I sat there in the parking lot and I watched that building and I waited. I waited for over 3 hours, sitting in my car drinking cold coffee from the cup holder and watching the front door and every window I could see. And my mind was racing through possibilities, trying to make sense of what I had seen. That boy had James's eyes, James's exact eyes, and Richard was visiting him every Wednesday for 3 years, visiting him with expensive educational toys and books and patience and attention. And the only explanations my brain could construct were impossible, were insane, but they wouldn't go away. At 6:30, Richard came out of the building, and the boy, Michael, walked him to the door, and even from across the parking lot I could see the way they interacted, the easy comfort, the obvious affection, Richard's hand on the boy's shoulder, the boy looking up at him with trust and something like love, and I watched my husband hug this child goodbye and get into his car and drive away, and I sat there shaking so hard my teeth chattered. I didn't follow Richard home. I sat there until the sun started setting, and I knew I couldn't sit anymore without Dorothy, or someone noticing my car had been there for hours. And then I drove. Not home, but just drove. And I tried to think clearly through the panic and confusion and growing certainty that something impossible was true. The next morning, Richard left for work at his normal time, and I was calm. I had spent the entire night not sleeping, but thinking, planning, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. I called the orphanage and asked to speak to Patricia, and when she answered, I told her I had really enjoyed the tour yesterday, and I was very interested in volunteering. Specifically, I was interested in working with children who had experienced loss or trauma because I had personal experience with grief, and I thought I could offer something valuable. Patricia sounded delighted, said they absolutely needed volunteers with that kind of empathy and understanding. And could I come in that afternoon to fill out paperwork and do a background check and discuss what role might suit me best? I said yes, I would be there at 2, and then I hung up and I sat at my kitchen table and I stared at the wall and I let myself think the thought I had been pushing away all night. What if James didn't die? What if my son, my baby boy who I watched them put in a tiny coffin and lower into the ground 13 years ago? What if he was alive? What if the child in that orphanage with Richard's undivided attention and my dead son's eyes was James? The thought was insane, impossible, the kind of thing that only happened in bad movies, but it also explained everything. The boy's age, the eyes, Richard's 3-year commitment, the expensive toys chosen for a specific child's interests, the elaborate lies, all of it made terrible perfect sense if James hadn't died at all but had been taken from me, hidden from me, stolen from me by the man I trusted most in the world. I thought about that morning 13 years ago when I found James not breathing, thought about Richard's face in the hospital, that look I had identified as guilt, thought about how quickly everything had moved, how Richard had handled all the arrangements, how I had been so destroyed by grief that I let him make every decision. Thought about the closed casket funeral, Richard insisting it was better for everyone to remember James as he was, healthy and beautiful. Thought about how I never actually saw my son's body after that morning in the hospital, how the doctors spoke to Richard privately, how everything that happened after James stopped breathing went through Richard first, and I only got the information he chose to give me. I thought about all of this, and I felt something inside me that had been soft and broken for 13 years turn into steel, hard and cold and absolutely clear about what I needed to do. I went to the orphanage that afternoon, and I filled out volunteer paperwork, and I smiled and answered questions, and passed the background check instantly because I had no criminal record. I was exactly what I appeared to be, a woman who had lost a child and wanted to help other children, and Patricia assigned me to work with the younger kids on basic literacy skills, reading together and helping with homework, starting next week. Perfect, I said. I'm really looking forward to it. And then I asked as casually as possible if I might meet some of the children today just to get a sense of the environment, and Patricia walked me through the facility again, introducing me to kids in different areas, and I waited patiently and pleasantly until we reached the library, and there he was again, Michael, sitting by himself reading a thick book about Egyptian mythology, and Patricia said, "Michael, this is Mrs. Thompson. She's going to be volunteering here and helping with reading." And the boy looked up at me and I looked into his eyes and I felt the earth stop rotating. They were James's eyes, identical, unmistakable, and not just the eyes but the shape of his face, the way his hair grew, the small scar above his left eyebrow that I knew James had gotten when he was 6 months old, falling against the edge of his crib. This was my son. This was my baby. This was James alive and breathing and sitting 3 feet away from me reading a book about pharaohs, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare while Patricia asked if I was all right, and Michael watched me with cautious curiosity. I managed to say I'm fine, sorry, just another dizzy spell, and I forced myself to look away from Michael's face, forced myself to smile and make small talk for a few more minutes before saying, "I really should get going. I'll see you next week for my first volunteer shift," and then I walked out of that building with my legs shaking and my vision tunneling and my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst through my ribs. I sat in my car and I made myself breathe, 5 counts in, 7 counts out, until the panic receded enough for me to think, and then I drove to the public library and I used their computers to search for information about Pine Grove Orphanage. It was a private facility, founded 8 years ago, funded through donations and grants, and the director, Patricia Morrison, had previously worked in social services for 20 years. I searched for the board of directors and found 6 names, and the third name on the list made my vision go dark around the edges. Richard Thompson, board member since the orphanage's founding, major financial contributor, personally involved in placement and care decisions for special needs cases. My husband, who told me he had Wednesday investor meetings, was on the board of directors of the orphanage where my supposedly dead son was living, and had been involved with this place since before Michael, since before James would have been old enough to be placed there. I sat at that library computer, and I read every piece of public information I could find about the orphanage and Richard's involvement, and I felt pieces clicking into place like a puzzle revealing a picture I couldn't bear to look at, but couldn't look away from. Richard had helped found this orphanage 3 years after James's supposed death, had been instrumental in its creation, had personally overseen certain placements, and 3 years ago, when James would have been 10 years old, a boy named Michael had come to the facility, a boy with no public records I could find, no birth certificate online, no previous address, nothing, just appeared in the system as a 5-year-old orphan in need of care, and Richard had immediately begun weekly visits. I printed everything I found, paid for the copies with shaking hands, and drove home, and when Richard came home that evening at his usual time, I looked at him across the dinner table and I saw a stranger, a monster, someone capable of a cruelty so profound I couldn't fully comprehend it yet. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of my life, harder even than the grief after losing James, because at least then I knew what I was dealing with. I knew my son was dead, or thought I did, but now I knew nothing and everything all at once, and I had to pretend everything was normal, while I investigated and planned and built my case piece by piece. I started my volunteer work at the orphanage, and I was patient and professional and kind to all the children, but I watched Michael, watched him from a distance, noticed the way he moved, the expressions that crossed his face, the particular tilt of his head when he was thinking hard about something, and every single gesture was familiar. Was James? Was my baby boy grown into a person I hadn't been allowed to know? I didn't approach him directly beyond polite hellos, because I couldn't trust myself not to break down, not to grab him and hold him and never let go. And I needed to be smart about this, needed to understand the full scope of what had been done to me before I made any moves that could be used against me. I befriended Patricia, invited her to coffee, learned everything I could about how Michael came to be at the orphanage, and the story she told me was carefully constructed and completely false. She said Michael had been removed from an abusive home situation when he was 5, that his mother had died and his father was unfit, that it had been a difficult case, but Richard had personally ensured the boy was placed somewhere safe, and hearing her say this, hearing this woman who seemed genuinely kind talk about my son like he was some rescued orphan when I was his mother, when I had loved him and wanted him and grieved him for years, it took every ounce of control I had not to scream the truth right there in that coffee shop, but I smiled and nodded and said how wonderful that Richard was so dedicated, and Patricia agreed and said Richard had a personal connection to the case, that he had lost a son years ago, and helping Michael seemed to be his way of healing. And I felt my blood turn to ice water because he was using James's death, using the lie of James's death, as motivation for his charity work with the son he had stolen from me. I hired a private investigator, paid cash, didn't tell him my real name, just said I needed deep background on Richard Thompson, and particularly anything involving children or unusual financial transactions around 13 years ago, and then again, 8 years ago, and then 5 years ago when Michael appeared. The investigator was thorough and discreet, and within a week, he had found things that confirmed my worst fears and revealed details that made the betrayal even more elaborate than I had imagined. 13 years ago, Richard had taken out a life insurance policy on James just 2 months before his supposed death. A policy for $500,000 that he collected and used to fund the early stages of the orphanage's creation. The hospital records from the morning James stopped breathing were sealed, requiring a court order to access, which was unusual for a straightforward SIDS case. Richard had made substantial cash withdrawals in the weeks before James's death, withdrawals that matched payments to a doctor who had since left the country, a doctor who had been investigated but never charged with falsifying death certificates. The investigator found property records showing Richard owned a house I didn't know about, a house 2 towns over that had been purchased 9 years ago and sold 5 years ago, right around the time Michael appeared at the orphanage. I sat in my living room reading this report while Richard was at work, and I felt my entire body shaking with rage so profound it felt like I was vibrating at a frequency that could shatter glass. He had planned this, planned all of it, faked our son's death, paid people to help him, kept James hidden for years in a house I didn't know existed. And then when James got old enough to potentially remember me or ask questions, Richard had placed him in an orphanage he controlled, an orphanage where he could visit weekly and maintain a relationship while I believed my child was dead and buried and lost to me forever. I spent 2 more weeks gathering evidence, making copies of everything, storing it in 3 different locations, and I didn't confront Richard, didn't give any sign that I knew, because I needed to understand one more thing before I acted. I needed to know if James, if Michael, if my son remembered me at all, if he knew who I was, if Richard had poisoned him against me, or told him I was dead too, or simply erased me from his memory entirely. So one afternoon at the orphanage when I saw Michael in the library alone, I sat down near him, not too close, just close enough to talk, and I said I noticed you reading about Egypt last week. I used to love ancient history too, and he looked up at me with those eyes, those perfect dark eyes, and said, "It's interesting how they believed in life after death, like people could come back," and something in the way he said it made my heart stop. "Do you believe that?" I asked carefully. "Do you believe people can come back?" And he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I used to have dreams about a woman with a voice like yours," she would sing to me. "But Mr. Richard says dreams are just our brains processing memories that aren't real." And I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I kept my voice steady and asked, "What song did she sing in your dreams?" And Michael looked at me with such intensity, such focus, and he hummed a melody, and it was Brahms's Lullaby, the song I sang to James every single night from the day he was born until the morning I thought he died. I wanted to grab him, wanted to tell him I was the woman in his dreams, that I was his mother, that I had been searching for him in every dark-haired child I saw for 13 years. But I forced myself to just smile and say, "That's a beautiful melody. Your brain must have picked it up from somewhere." And he nodded, but he kept looking at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle, and I made myself stand up and walk away before I broke down completely. That night I confronted Richard, but not with screaming or accusations. I did it with strategic precision. I waited until dinner was over, and we were sitting in the living room, and I said casually, "I started volunteering at Pine Grove Orphanage, and I watched his face, watched the color drain from his skin, watched his hands grip the armrests of his chair, watched panic flash through his eyes before he managed to smooth his expression into mild interest and say, 'Oh, that's nice. What made you decide to do that?' I smiled at him, a cold smile, a dangerous smile, and I said I was inspired by your dedication, by the way you spend every Wednesday there with Michael, and the name dropped between us like a bomb." Richard's face went completely white and he started to speak, but I held up my hand and I said, Don't lie to me anymore. I know everything. I know James didn't die. I know you took him from me. I know about the fake death certificate and the insurance money and the house you kept him in and the orphanage you created to hide him when he got older. I know all of it, and now you're going to tell me why." The silence that followed was immense. crushing, and I watched my husband of 32 years decide how to play this, watched him run through options, and then his face changed into something I had never seen before, something hard and cold and completely devoid of the man I thought I knew. He said you were an unfit mother, said it calmly like he was stating an objective fact, said you were depressed and unstable and obsessed with James in an unhealthy way, and I knew if I left him with you, something bad would happen. So I saved him. I saved our son from you. The lie was so audacious, so perfectly constructed to make me the villain in this story, that for a moment I couldn't even respond. And Richard kept talking, kept building his narrative, said I gave you a chance to grieve and move on and build a better life, but you couldn't let go. You stayed broken. You proved I was right to protect James from your instability. I looked at my husband lying to my face and trying to gaslight me into believing that stealing my child and letting me think he was dead for 13 years was somehow for my own good, and I felt something inside me that had been cold turn into pure ice, the kind that burns, the kind that destroys everything it touches. I looked at Richard and I said very quietly, very calmly, you have 48 hours to turn yourself in to the police and confess everything, to bring James home, to start making this right, and if you don't, I will destroy you so completely that you will wish you had died the day you decided to steal my son. Richard laughed, actually laughed, and said you have no proof of anything. It's your word against mine and the legal documentation of James's death and 13 years of you being the grieving, unstable widow. No one will believe you. You'll just look crazy. I smiled again and I said, I have the investigator's report. I have financial records. I have witness statements from people you paid. I have everything I need to bury you. But more than that, I have our son. I have Michael, who remembers me even though you tried to erase me, who dreams about my voice, who knows somewhere deep in his soul that he had a mother who loved him, and when I tell him the truth, when I show him who you really are, you will lose him forever, and that will hurt you more than anything the legal system can do. Richard's face changed then, real fear replacing arrogance, and he said, you wouldn't do that to him. You wouldn't traumatize him by telling him his whole life is a lie. And I leaned forward and I said, watch me. You took 13 years of his childhood from me. You let me suffer grief that nearly killed me. You used my son as a toy in whatever sick game you've been playing, and now you will face consequences for every single choice you made. I'm giving you 48 hours not because you deserve it, but because I want you to feel what I felt. I want you to lie awake at night knowing your world is about to end and being powerless to stop it. Think of it as a gift. 2 days to say goodbye to the life you built on my suffering. Richard didn't turn himself in? Of course he didn't. Narcissists never do. They always believe they can talk their way out, manipulate their way free, convince everyone else that reality is whatever they say it is. So, 48 hours later, I went to the police with every piece of evidence I had gathered, walked into the station with my investigator's report and my financial records and my timeline of lies, and I filed charges for fraud, kidnapping, child endangerment, insurance fraud, and about 6 other crimes that my lawyer, the excellent, ruthless lawyer I had hired with money from my inheritance that Richard didn't know I still had, assured me would stick. The investigation moved quickly once I presented my evidence. DNA tests were ordered. James/Michael's real identity was confirmed within a week, and I will never forget the moment they brought him to me. Officially, legally, the moment a social worker walked him into the family reunification room and said, Michael, this is your mother, your biological mother. And I looked at my 13-year-old son who I had last held as a 7-month-old baby, and I started crying. Couldn't help it. 13 years of grief and rage and loss pouring out all at once. James looked at me, really looked at me, and he said, you're the woman from the library. You're the voice from my dreams. And I nodded and said, yes, baby. Yes, I'm your mother. I have always been your mother. I never left you. You were taken from me, and I've been looking for you in every face I saw for 13 years. And he was crying too. And the social worker stepped back, and I held my son, held him for the first time in 13 years. And he felt right in my arms, felt like he had always belonged there, and I whispered, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't find you sooner, but I found you now, and I will never let anyone take you from me again. If watching this mother get her son back after 13 years of unnecessary grief, if seeing this woman who refused to accept the lies she was told finally hold her child again, gives you even a fraction of the hope and vindication it gave me to live it, hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more mothers who are being told they're crazy when they know something is wrong, who are being gaslit by people they trust, who need to see that trusting your instincts and fighting for truth can lead to impossible miracles. Women who need to know that maternal love is the most powerful force in the universe, and when you try to destroy it with lies and theft, it will hunt you down, and it will win. Like this video right now, because stories of mothers who never gave up, who trusted themselves when everyone doubted them, who fought through grief and manipulation to find their children. These stories need to be seen by everyone, especially young mothers who are just learning to trust their instincts. Like it now. Richard was arrested 3 days after my reunion with James, arrested at his office in front of all his colleagues, and the charges were extensive and damning. The investigation revealed he hadn't acted alone. There was a network of people he had paid over the years to maintain the lie. The doctor who falsified the death certificate and had fled to Costa Rica was extradited and gave a full confession in exchange for a reduced sentence, detailing how Richard had approached him 6 months before James's supposed death with the plan. How Richard had drugged James that morning to make him appear not breathing. How the hospital visit was staged with the doctor's help. How Richard had taken James immediately after and hidden him. The funeral home director who had provided a fake body for the closed casket funeral, actually just a weighted box, also confessed under pressure. Richard's business partner, who had helped finance the orphanage, not knowing its real purpose at first, but figuring it out later and staying silent, he turned state's evidence. The woman who had cared for James in that secret house for 4 years before he was placed in the orphanage, she came forward with her story and text messages and proof of payments. Every piece of Richard's carefully constructed lie unraveled thread by thread, and what was revealed underneath was a conspiracy so cruel and so calculated that even the prosecutors were shocked. Richard's motivation, it turned out, was exactly as shallow and pathetic as I suspected. He had wanted to be a father, but found the reality of fatherhood with an infant too demanding, too restrictive, too much of an interference with his career ambitions and his image as a successful bachelor-turned-family man. He wanted a son he could mold and control without a mother's interference, wanted to play the role of devoted father on his own terms, without the messy reality of a marriage and co-parenting. So he had created an elaborate plan to take James from me, to make me believe my son was dead so I wouldn't search for him, and to raise James in secret until he was old enough to be placed in an orphanage Richard controlled, where Richard could visit weekly and play the role of beneficent mentor and father figure, while maintaining his public image as the tragic widower who lost his child. It was narcissism at its most grotesque, a man who loved the idea of fatherhood but not the reality, who was willing to destroy multiple lives to maintain his fantasy of control. The trial was brutal and public and deeply satisfying. Richard's lawyers tried everything, tried to paint me as mentally unstable, tried to suggest I had false memories, tried to claim the DNA evidence was contaminated, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the testimonies from people Richard had paid were damning, and the jury saw through every manipulation tactic his defense employed. James, my James, who now wanted to be called by his real name again, testified in a closed session about his memories, about the dreams he'd had of me, about how Richard had told him his mother was dead, but something inside him never believed it, about the songs he remembered and the feeling he'd always had that part of his life was missing. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours and found Richard guilty on every single charge. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for kidnapping, fraud, and child endangerment, plus additional time for the insurance fraud and conspiracy charges. And when the judge read the sentence, Richard's face crumpled, and he looked at me across the courtroom with something like disbelief, like he still couldn't quite accept that his plan had failed, that his lies had been exposed, that he was actually going to face consequences. And I looked back at him with zero pity, zero forgiveness, just cold satisfaction that justice, finally, after 13 years, was being served. The judge made a point during sentencing of addressing me directly, said Mrs. Thompson. "No sentence can give you back the years you lost with your son, but I hope this verdict gives you some measure of peace, and I commend your strength and persistence in seeking truth." And I nodded and said, "Thank you, Your Honor," and I meant it. The aftermath has been complicated and beautiful, and sometimes painful, but mostly just filled with joy I didn't think I would ever feel again. James moved in with me immediately after Richard's arrest, and we've spent the last 18 months learning each other, becoming mother and son again, filling in 13 years of missing pieces. He's in therapy, I'm in therapy, we're in family therapy together, and slowly, carefully, we're building a relationship that was stolen from us. He's 15 now, tall and smart and funny and kind, and every single day I look at him and feel overwhelming gratitude that my instincts were right, that I didn't accept the lie, that I trusted myself enough to investigate and fight and demand truth. We talk about everything, about his memories of early childhood that were suppressed but are starting to surface, about the years in the secret house with the caretaker who was kind to him but wouldn't tell him about his real family, about his time in the orphanage feeling like something was wrong but not knowing what, about Richard's visits and the strange mix of love and manipulation in their relationship. James is angry at Richard, deeply angry, but he's also grieving the father figure he thought he had, and I let him feel all of it, support him through all of it, because this is complex and messy, and there are no easy answers when someone you loved turns out to be someone who hurt you profoundly. I've had to learn how to be a mother to a teenager when the last time I mothered him he was a baby, had to catch up on 13 years of parenting overnight, and it's hard and beautiful, and I wouldn't trade a single difficult moment for anything, because he's here, my son is here, alive and safe and home, and Richard's family, his parents and sister who I thought were my family too, they abandoned me the moment the truth came out, chose to believe Richard's lies about me being unstable, refused to accept that their son and brother was capable of such cruelty. They still send him letters in prison, still maintain he was somehow protecting James from me, and their denial is almost as painful as Richard's original betrayal, because it shows how deeply narcissism runs in that family, how they would rather believe an elaborate, comfortable lie than accept an uncomfortable truth. I don't speak to any of them anymore, cut them off completely, and the loss of that family connection was hard but necessary because I refuse to allow anyone in my life or James's life who can't acknowledge reality. My own family, my parents and siblings who supported me through the grief of losing James, and who were absolutely shattered when they learned he had been alive all along, they've been incredible, surrounding us with love and support and helping us rebuild. My mother cried for 3 days straight when she met teenage James, kept touching his face like she couldn't believe he was real, kept apologizing to me for not knowing, for not seeing through Richard's lies, and I told her there was nothing to apologize for, that Richard had fooled everyone, that the only person responsible for this nightmare was Richard himself. We've had to grieve together, my family and I, grieve the lost years, grieve the grandparent and aunt and uncle relationships that were stolen, grieve the milestones we missed, and then we've had to intentionally choose joy, choose to focus on the miracle of James being alive and home instead of dwelling in the tragedy of the years we lost. James and I are building a life together that's wholly ours, free from Richard's control and lies. We moved to a new house, left behind the place filled with memories of grief and deception, started fresh in a neighborhood where no one knows our story unless we choose to tell it. James is thriving in school, making friends, joining clubs, doing all the normal teenage things he missed out on for years, and watching him become himself, watching him grow into his personality and interests and opinions without Richard's manipulation shaping him. It's the greatest gift I've ever received. He's interested in history and archaeology, wants to maybe study Egyptology in college, and I encourage every interest, every dream, every ambition, because I lost 13 years of being able to do that, and I will never take for granted the privilege of supporting my son's growth again. We talk about the future constantly, make plans, dream together, and sometimes James will look at me and say, "I can't believe you found me. I can't believe you didn't give up." And I tell him every time that I would have searched for him forever, that a mother's love doesn't die just because someone tells you it should, that he was always alive in my heart even when I thought he was gone, and finding him wasn't luck or coincidence. It was inevitable, because I was always going to trust myself. Eventually, I was always going to see through the lies. Eventually, truth was always going to win. Now let me talk directly to you, because if you've watched this far, you're probably not just here for the story. You're here because something in my experience resonates with your own life, with your own situation, with your own instincts that are telling you something is wrong, even though everyone around you says everything is fine. Listen to me very carefully. Woman to woman, mother to mother, survivor to someone who might still be in the middle of their nightmare. Your instincts are not paranoia. Your gut feelings are not anxiety. Your sense that something is wrong is not you being dramatic or overly sensitive or crazy, like they want you to believe. When something feels wrong, it usually is wrong. And the people who benefit from you doubting yourself, from you staying confused and compliant and quiet, they will do everything in their power to convince you that you're imagining things, that you're remembering wrong, that you're too emotional to see clearly. Do not believe them. Believe yourself. Trust the voice inside that speaks truth, even when that truth is terrifying. I spent 13 years accepting a reality that never felt quite right, ignoring the small inconsistencies and odd moments and strange behaviors, because I was taught that good wives trust their husbands, that good women don't rock the boat, that questioning people you love means you're damaged or broken or paranoid. But the only thing that was broken was the situation I was in. And the only way I found my son, the only way I got my miracle, was by finally trusting myself more than I trusted the lies I was being told. You might not have a stolen child. Your situation might be completely different. But if you're in a relationship or family dynamic or situation where you constantly feel like you're going crazy, where your reality doesn't match what people tell you is reality, where you have evidence of something wrong but everyone dismisses that evidence, then you need to do what I did. You need to investigate, document, gather proof, and most importantly, trust that you deserve truth even when truth is hard. You are not too old to start over. You are not too damaged to heal. You are not too far gone to reclaim your life from people who have stolen pieces of it through lies and manipulation. I was 51 years old when I found my son. 51 years old when I finally stood up to a man I had trusted for over 3 decades. 51 years old when I completely dismantled my life and rebuilt it according to my truth instead of his lies. And it was hard and terrifying and the best thing I ever did. Your age is not a weakness. It's actually your greatest strength because you have decades of experience reading people, noticing patterns, understanding dynamics. And that experience is valuable, is powerful, is the exact thing manipulators fear most, which is why they try so hard to make you doubt it. You've spent years or maybe decades developing your instincts and your intuition. Trust those tools. Use them. Let them guide you toward truth even when truth requires you to blow up everything you thought you knew about your life. I'm not special. I'm not unusually strong or brave or capable. I'm just a mother who loved her son, and a woman who finally decided that living in truth, no matter how painful, was better than living in a comfortable lie. And if I can do that, if I can investigate and fight and reclaim my child and my life after 13 years of being manipulated and gaslight, so can you. Whatever your situation is, whatever truth you're being denied, you have the power to demand it, to find it, to build your life around it instead of around lies that serve everyone except you. If this story moved you, shook you, inspired you, or made you think differently about trusting your instincts and demanding truth, I need you to do 3 things right now before you click away. First, like this video, hit that thumbs up right now so the algorithm shows this to more women who need to see it. Women who are doubting themselves right now, who are being told they're crazy or paranoid or overly emotional when they know something is wrong. You're like literally helps other women find this story and find permission to trust themselves. Do it now. Second, subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications. And I mean all notifications, not just some, because next week I'm sharing the story of a 47-year-old woman who discovered her sister had been slowly poisoning her for 2 years to steal her inheritance, and what she did when she found out, how she gathered evidence and exposed the truth and got justice, will leave you absolutely speechless. It involves a family dinner, hidden cameras, and a confession no one saw coming. You won't want to miss it. And third, most important, comment below and tell me, what is your gut telling you right now that you've been afraid to acknowledge? What truth have you been avoiding because accepting it would require you to change everything? Because your story matters, your instincts matter, your truth matters. And this community is here to remind you that you're never too old, never too broken, never too far gone to reclaim your life from people who have built their comfort on your confusion. Share what you're really feeling in the comments right now. I read every single one, and so do thousands of other women who come here looking for validation and strength and permission to trust themselves. Do all three things now, and I'll see you next week with another story of a woman who refused to accept lies as truth. Thank you for trusting me with your time and your heart today. Now go trust yourself the way I finally learned to trust myself. Your truth is waiting for you to claim it.